Well, good evening, everybody. I want to start by saying that this event is being recorded. However, rest assured that neither your video nor your audio will be part of that recording. We cannot see you. You can only see us. I'm Ryan Orgera, and I am the CEO of the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. And welcome to our Evening at the Homestead lecture series. Let me just say on behalf of myself and the whole of SCCF, we can't wait to have you back actually at the Homestead, hopefully soon. So SCCF has just entered our 54th year of conservation on our islands. Science and service to our nature and our communities are our top priorities. And tonight, we're very lucky to welcome a world-renowned scientist. Let me start with just two quick housekeeping issues. One, because of the nature of this webinar, you'll have to pose questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a computer, it will be at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a handheld device or an iPad, for instance, simply touch the screen and you should be able to see the Q&A button where you can enter questions. Should we have time, we will be able to answer these questions at the end of the presentation. So joining us from Adelaide in South Australia, Dr. Patrick Hesp is actually in the future because it is tomorrow, Thursday, the 21st of January in Australia currently. Professor Patrick Hesp was born in New Zealand. He's completed his bachelor's and master's degrees from Massey University in New Zealand and holds a PhD in coastal geomorphology from the University of Sydney. He was awarded a DSc from Massey University in 2013. This is not a degree that you commonly hear of in the United States, but let me say this is an incredible honor and given mostly in the Commonwealth nations, and is something that is awarded to important scholars for a career of incredible merit. So he has held academic positions in Australia, Singapore, the United States, New Zealand, non-academic positions in the Washington State Department of Agriculture. He has held visiting professorships in South Africa, Namibia, Israel, Holland, China, Brazil, Italy, Malaysia, Thailand, and France, and has worked on the beaches and coastal and desert dunes all over the world. He is an expert on coastal dune geomorphology and has published over 290 articles in his career to date. Patrick Hesp is indeed a giant in his field. And on a personal note, he and I spent 6 hours stuck at the US-Mexico border one time because we could not make the border agents understand that Mr. Louisiana State University was not indeed a human and therefore could not present himself to provide permission to take a university vehicle across the border. Well, we eventually prevailed despite the hiccup. I was lucky enough to participate in a field course on sand dunes in Veracruz State, where I got to witness firsthand how much energy it requires to study massive dunes. Patrick, take it away. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's a pleasure to be here. Hi, everybody. Let me just share my screen with you. I hope this works. Here we go. So my plan here is to show you hopefully some pretty pictures of coastal dunes and to give you some idea of what is out there in the world and a little bit about how they operate. First, most coastal dunes are situated on the top of coastal barriers. And here's a horribly academic definition of a coastal barrier. But as you can hopefully see in this picture, here is a suite of 4 dunes, or what are commonly called in the US beach ridges, a sequence of them 7,000 years old at the back and yesterday afternoon at the front. And basically, this comprises this barrier system, which is basically built of anything from sand to boulders formed by waves and tidal and wind processes. And you know, they can look like the previous picture, or over that 7,000 year period, you just have one dune here with an old lake in behind. You might have a very low barrier island, which is dominated by hurricane washover events. Similarly here along the Florida coast and the Gulf after one of the hurricanes. or larger scale dune systems on top of those barriers, as you see here in Southern California. And in some cases, of course, they're actually plastered up against old coastlines. So here are some climbing and cliff top dunes in northwestern Australia comprising a barrier system. So firstly, we'll just do a little bit of Barriers 101 and look at how they get there. And basically, they're entirely driven really by sea level change. So this shows you zero here. So we're up here somewhere in this high sea level event. About 100,000 years ago or so, 120,000 years ago, there was a previous high sea level event. And these have occurred every 100,000 years or so for the last 3 million. So what tends to happen is sea level falls in this seesaw fashion until it gets to minus 100, minus 120 meters below sea level, and then very rapidly rises as the glaciers melt, water pours back into the oceans, fills them up, and we come up to a high sea level event. And if we look at this part here in more detail, you see here from various parts in the world, changes in sea level in the last 20,000 years. So sea level was around a minus 130, 150, 20,000 years ago, rose fairly rapidly to the present, reaching the present at different times in different parts of the world, 6,000, 7,000 years in a lot of the southern hemisphere, closer to maybe 4,000 years in your part of the world. And this is a major driver, this sea level change, for producing barriers, because basically sea level doesn't get to present and then suddenly make a beach. It actually makes a beach and quite often dune systems and large barriers as it's rising up across the formerly exposed shelf. And so what tends to happen is that at some sea level, time zero is indicated here, you've already got a beach, at least maybe a little washover platform here, but maybe some dunes on top. And as sea level continues to rise, sand is swept landwards, filling in estuaries and lagoons behind those barriers, so that by the time sea level gets to the present level, in this case it's just indicated as time 10, we have our barrier formed. And then of course after that, what might happen is sediment's continually supplied to that system and you build a much wider, bigger barrier over time. There might be very little sediment in the system and it continues to roll landwards, particularly with storms and hurricanes and tsunamis, etc. And so it develops over time, just depending then how much sediment you pump into the system. And if we look at that 20,000 years ago, here are some contours around a river valley. The river is flowing out here, out to the low sea level coastline. Old sea cliffs are here. And then as sea level comes up, then it floods that river valley, forms our barrier of various types across the top, reinvigorates the rock platforms, floods the valley in behind, forming an estuary, lagoons, deltas, etc. So basically, the barrier here is formed by that driver sea level change, and particularly sea level rise in the last 20,000 years. And so then basically you have a bunch of dune types that form on top of those barriers. In some cases, of course, with very little sediment supply, you get almost no dunes at all, which is typical of some of the barriers of the Gulf Coast, as we'll see later. So basically, we can then break this down into a few dune types. So 4 dunes, the first dune at the back of the beach. If they build over time, we make these 4 dune plains, also known in the US as beach ridges or beach ridge plains. Parabolic dunes, transgressive dune fields, and blowouts, wind-eroded hollows and troughs can be formed on any of these. Very common on 4 dunes, but can be formed on any of these systems. And of course, they're also very common in deserts. I'm going to run you through some pictures of each of these and give you a little bit of background about how they work. So 4 dunes are just dunes formed by aeolian or wind-blown sand deposition within pioneer plant communities on the backshore. So plants here alter the roughness, the aerodynamic roughness of the surface. They slow the wind down. When sand is being transported in the wind, it gets slowed down, deposited in here to form these little low ridges that start 4 dunes. And of course, they can build over time to be much larger 4 dunes. Quite commonly, they might start as discrete seedling germination on the backshore, so that you see here individual plants, and this species is Kakali, which is also on your shores in part. They form individual little depositional mounds within the plants, and these are known by an Arab name called nebka, essentially a discrete dune formed by sand deposition in the plant. Over time, other plants may grow out onto here, as you see happening here, and stabilize this and form a new dune ridge. Quite often, plants have quite significant rhizomes and stolons, these runners that grow down from older areas of plants, from a parent source area, and so they grow out onto the beach, they start to stabilize it, they trap sand, they form dunes or foredunes by that means. You very commonly see this in tropical environments where there's lots of beach runners, such as this Ipamea here in Senegal. And then you also get laterally continuous growth of pioneer plants on the back shore. So this is a swash zone here where the high tide waves have come up, deposited this deposit, which we call rack. It's just basically organic material. In this case, it's almost entirely seed material. In this case, of a plant that is the dominant pioneer plant in Australia and New Zealand and Java and a couple of other places, a plant called Spinifex, which looks a lot like your Uniola. And this is the same area just a few months later. So all those seeds have been covered by a little bit of sand, germinated, formed a very extensive sward of grass, which is now trapping sand. And this is 6 months later, and you can see as sand continues to blow in, the sand gets trapped and forms a nice foredune ridge. And of course, you can also get plant material that is eroded from some other place during storms, then deposited on the beach, as you see here. And quite a lot of that material is quite resistant to salt water, gets covered by a little bit of sand, and will grow a new dune. So here we are in June 2007, and by a bit more than a year later, that's the same area, and seeds and rhizomes are sprouting from this storm deposited material and building a new foredune. So that's the main ways in which these things develop. In temperate environments, we see very significant long foredune ridges, such as you see here in Oregon, where there are very big foredunes formed in Ammophila. In Cape San Blas, of course, very nice dunes, and similarly in your part of the world, just down the road. They can form very, very big dunes over time. So these are 15, 20 meter high foredunes in a place called Dunas Altas, which is basically high dunes in Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. So if they sit on the back of the beach for a very long time and there's a sediment supply, they can be very large. Here in Spinifex in New Zealand, here on the Liber Barrier in Poland, where I've been doing some work with a big sand transport event going on at the time. And you might get a single species in some cases, or lots of species in other cases. So here, Blutoperon species in Peru, Ammophila arenaria forming very big foredunes and little new foredunes in Northern Ireland. But as it becomes more arid, it's more and more difficult for plants to grow, of course, because there's very little nutrients. There's also lots of salt spray retained in the sand because there's not much rainfall. And so it's quite common for the foredune zone or the foredunes to be formed just by nebka. So they never form ridges because there's just too much competition for nutrients, and particularly for water. And so here in the Nama desert fringe, coastal fringe, also you only get nebka. And of course, in extreme climatic and arid environments, such as here in the Arctic, then you get nebka. You see the guy standing on here in Iceland for scale, and a woman walking through the nebka field here for scale. So in very arid and cold environments, very difficult for the plants to grow, so only nebka form, as you see here also, pictures from Iceland. And similarly, all down the Moroccan, Saharan, West African arid coast, where rainfall's only 30, 40 millimeters a year. If you're lucky, then only nebka form in these foredune environments. So here's an area in Western Sahara, southwest of Dakhla, where I just was, and you only have nebka, and very commonly the dunes are climbing dunes and clifftop dunes, as you see here. So if that process continues, in other words, as you see in this picture, the plants grow seawards, or we get new plants growing out on the back of the beach, and sand keeps being provided to the beach, so new foredunes keep forming over time, then we basically build these relict foredune plains, whereas we see here the modern foredune forming in the front. And as a new foredune forms in front of the old one, then you just build them again and again and again, so you end up with these beach ridge or foredune plains over time. And they're quite common along significant parts of the Gulf Coast and the Florida coast. So we see here in Capes and Blass, where sand is being supplied to the beach, we build a new foredune, as you see here, building on top of the berm in this case, that sandy deposit that the waves make at the back of the beach. You build a new one over time again and again, and you form a series of them on top. So in your part of the world in Sanibel Island, that's a common way that your foredunes are formed. And basically what you're seeing, is new plants growing out on the back of the beach, starting to fill in here with plant material, trapping sand and forming a new foredune ridge, and you do that again and again. And so here, that same area a little while later in an area that is prograding or building seawards quite rapidly. And this is in the swale just behind over here. And of course, in Capes and Blass, very good example and similar to some of your barrier islands just to the north of Sanibel, where you get these big spit platforms, subaqueous underwater spit platforms, that slowly build up out of the surface, prograde along shore, as you see in here, and then plants grow on them and you build new ridges by that means too. And so quite often you get a swash bar building up out of the water, becomes completely out of the water, and then new dunes form on the top. And you see quite a lot of that development in your barrier islands in some places too. So, these spits prograde and build along shore, then come up out of the water, and then you start new dune ridges here. And quite often these small lagoons, linear lagoons, are left behind as they build. And so, this here, which is developed just purely because this spit came along and locked onto the shore here and to here, eventually becomes one of these, and these ridges here, which are colonized by the taller trees because they're higher ground, envelope those areas. So you have very similar examples of these on Sanibel Island. And if we look at you in particular, if we look at these ridge forms here, that's exactly how those dune ridges have been formed. Look in more detail and you can see clearly these ridge lines, and those are just a sequence of foredunes that have been formed over time as sand's been supplied to the barrier and building the system out over time. And of course, depending on where you are, it's a lot more dynamic in some places and a lot less in others. So some of these spits where sand is being transported along shore, locking off these lagoons, are highly dynamic, and of course they change considerably when hurricanes come along as well. So you can see big changes here as entrances have opened up and changed and shifted. Hurricanes break through here, then they close up and move around. But here is the original spit development here before this part of the spit grew. So the foredune ridges can build by different ways, but basically your part of the world dominated by these former foredune ridges. And of course, just depending on when you get a hurricane, then they may be quite stable, but they might not. So here is part of the Capes and Blass area in 2017, smashed open by Hurricane Michael in 2018, and here's a ground picture of that area. So they can be very, very dynamic places, and of course, if you're building on top of these, then you can certainly be in harm's way. And in many cases along the Gulf Coast, we have switched from having a progradational system where lots of these ridges were built out over time to where the shoreline is now changing radically. There's no new sediment supply. In fact, it's negative sediment supply. And so we're switching to an overwash dominated system where hurricanes come along once in a while, smash into this, cannibalize the dunes, and form these overwash sheets and terraces and push the barrier back and realign the barriers, etc. And so, one of the big problems for the Gulf Coast, of course, is not only the subsidence taking these down, but the fact that there's no new sediment supply into these systems, and so they're switching to highly erosional barriers. And of course, in some cases where you've only ever had a very small sediment supply, we've only ever had very small foredunes over time, and so they get easily smashed in a big storm surge in hurricanes, and you end up looking like this, and the barriers then retreat and translate and roll over landwards over time. The foredunes can rebuild to a degree between hurricanes, depending on what sediment supply comes back after the storms. And in some cases, and in many cases, these barriers are just destined now to be rolling back and translating over time, especially as sea level continues to rise into the future. And of course, where you put these nice little beach houses right on the beach in harm's way, you end up in this kind of situation, as I'm sure you well know. All right, so the second dune type that I talked about that I'll put in here as opposed to later are blowouts. And this is Maupertuis Bay on Kangaroo Island, which is just south off the coast from where I live. You may have heard it had some of the most disastrous fires ever seen in this part of the world. So all of this has been burnt except for these little green bits. But this is a four-dune blowout complex. So these are blowouts, which are wind-eroded troughs and hollows, and very, very common in four-dunes, but also other dune terrains. So they're a bowl-shaped, cup-shaped, trough-shaped hollow formed purely by wind erosion on some pre-existing deposit. They typically have these erosion, deflation basins in the bottom where the wind's eroding the sediment out, the side erosional walls, and the sand eroded out of there gets deposited downwind in this trough blowout to form these depositional lobes. They vary considerably, so we have small saucer blowouts here, very shallow shaped things, very like the saucer for your cup of tea. Bowl blowouts, which are deeper bowls, and as I showed you in that diagram before, trough blowouts, which are larger, deeper, narrow troughs. Here's a question for you: why do golf links have sand bunkers? And you don't have to answer, but the reason is that Bonnie Prince Charlie popularized golf in the 1700s. In fact, his father, King James, banned it because he played too much. And they originally played golf on these links, which is actually a Celtic word, and we took that up to call them golf links later, where there were lots of blowouts. And so as we developed golf courses into the future, we put blowouts, aka golf bunkers, into all our major golf links or golf courses. I'll just show you one example of how these things develop. In Cape Cod, where we've done a lot of work in the past, the first stage of development is just these small sand patches. And we think this is just dieback of the Ammophila vegetation. And you can see there's no erosion at all. It's just an area where there is no vegetation. They very rapidly develop into these little saucer blowouts. Those develop into bowls, so they just keep eroding and develop into bowls. And the bowls enlarge and sometimes capture other bowls. So they can become very, very big. This is hundreds of meters across, this one. And quite often 2 or 3 bowls can then join together as they erode. For example, this area here erodes out into here, joins that one, and forms these very big features. At Cape Cod, they do this amazingly fast. So here's one of my former students in 2008 standing next to a meter deep saucer blowouts, a couple of meters long. We named our blowouts there. So this is Vixen's Baby because Vixen was a big one down the road. And this is just 3 years later, same guy. It's now 10 meters deep and 25 meters across. So in these very windy environments where the vegetation cover is very low in spring following heavy snows in winter, the rate of erosion is just phenomenal, and these things can develop extraordinarily quickly. Cape Cod, if you haven't been there, put it on your bucket list. It's the largest number of saucer and bowl blowouts in the world. Blowouts quite often evolve into parabolic dunes. So if they just keep eroding downwind, then they can evolve into what we call a parabolic dune. And this is a U-shaped or parabolic shaped dune. So as you see here, we've got this U shape, and here's the lobe of an active parabolic dune that's migrating downwind in that direction. And here are old ones that you see have been stabilized after some time being active. Plants grow up the sides and stabilize them and form these beautiful U-shaped dunes. You have lots of these on the west coast of the US, but very few in the Gulf Coast or the Florida Coast. There's lots of types. This is in Tasmania. This is in Western Australia. But as you can see, they have these long trailing ridges. So as this lobe advances downwind, or this one here, as you can see, plants grow up the sides and stabilize the sides. Sand is trapped on the sides, and so as they migrate downwind, they leave these beautiful trailing ridges and deflation plains behind. Formed on high energy coasts, so this is part of the New Zealand lower North Island west coast. It's actually prograding or building seawards. Sediment's being supplied to it about 1 meter per year, but it's a very high wind energy environment. So the foredune, which you see on the front here, is highly erosional, completely natural, and lots of blowouts form, and every once in a while one of those blowouts turns into parabolic dunes, as you can see here and here. Very easy to form on eroding coasts because as you destabilize the foredune and the older dune systems and take that sediment away, the dunes destabilize, the vegetation dies and collapses, and you can form these parabolic dunes very easily on eroding coasts. They quite often develop straight from the beach. So this is an example of multiple thin, long parabolic dunes in California, for example, and bigger, older ones in the back here. And as you see here in Fiji, the only decent parabolic dunes in the Fijian Islands, it's a group of people there for scale. So they can be very, very big at times. And they do evolve in the downwind end of transgressive dune fields, which we'll see in a moment, but larger, bigger sand deposits, as you see here, and classic examples in Madagascar. So as plants stabilize these larger, big dune fields, they turn into parabolics, as you see here. They're also very common in deserts. So this is just one example of a desert I'm working in northwest China at the moment. All right, and then transgressive dune fields. So our other fourth major dune type. Basically, these are like mini deserts. So if you imagine great sand dunes in the States, these are the similar sort of size in some cases, sometimes quite small, sometimes quite extensive. The largest transgressive dune field in the world is in South Australia. It's 150 kilometers long, going inland, that is. So they can be very, very extensive. So they're basically small to extensive dune field systems, and they're called transgressive dune fields because they transgress prior to rain. They're rolling over prior to rain. Sometimes they may be migrating principally along shore, depending on the main wind regime, sometimes blowing inland, as you see here in Namibia and in Western Australia. Very, very big ones on the South African south coast, on the South Australian coast, and on the Brazilian south coast. So this is the Yalata dune field in South Australia. That seemingly little ridge there is a 50-meter high ridge that you can see here from one of my aerial photographs. So they principally occur in high wave energy environments where waves pump sand on shore over time, and high wind energy environments where the sand can then, of course, be blown inland. And of course, they're particularly characteristic of semi-arid and arid environments, but also there's lots in temperate environments. So the biggest dune fields, coastal dune fields in America, for example, all along the California, Oregon, Washington coast, where you have high wave energy, high sediment supply, and high wind energy. And another example from South Australia, sand basically blowing straight inland from the beach, forming these very, very big transgressive dune fields. Example in South Africa, wonderful example in Socotra in Yemen. So you see these climbing transgressive dunes here, and here's the picture standing in here. This was on my bucket list until the locals decided to start cutting the heads off all the tourists. And of course, the Oregon dunes are a classic example you should put on your bucket list if you haven't been there. Wonderful dune fields all along the Florence, Oregon coast, but Oregon, Washington coast, dominated by these large-scale transgressive dune fields. You know, over time, of course, they change considerably. So as they migrate inland, vegetation recolonizes these deflation plains. So the wind erodes it down to near the surface of the water table, and plants can come back in. Foredunes may form again after this phase of activity, and you might have multiple phases of dune development over the last 6,000–7,000 years, depending how much sediment supply is available. Quite often, it's common to see both parabolic dunes and transgressive dune fields together in dune fields and of all sorts of different sizes. So relatively small ones here in Mozambique, very big ones here, and large-scale transgressive dunes forming at the same time. And of course, all of these dune fields may be colonized by vegetation over time. It might be as a result of climate change. It might just be that the sediment supply diminishes for a while during a particular phase. And so it's quite common to see these areas, particularly the lower areas where water is more available and abundant, for plants to start growing and then spread up the dunes and stabilize the dune fields over time. So this was a formerly completely stabilized 7,000-year-old dune field, again in Kangaroo Island, showing you multiple phases of these landward ridges that developed as phase after phase of dune fields came through and then stabilized. And of course, in this case, this is 5 months after these massive fires burnt everything down. This was covered in forest. And I'll just show you one example we're looking at the moment. Adelaide, where I live, is sitting in here and up the top of Gulf St. Vincent. And this is Kangaroo Island, where we were seeing the fire area here. And there's this very long barrier system, the longest barrier system in Australia, 180 kilometres long, a place called 42 Mile Crossing here, which is close to this area sitting here. Here's the barrier and the lagoon system here. And in there, we've been doing photographic analysis and drone monitoring. And this is a series of pictures over time starting in 1978. And they're all geographically located in the same place. So why you see more and more surf zone here is because the coastline is rapidly retreating over time. And what you see is about 160 meters of erosion of the shoreline since 1978. And at about 2008 to 2013, it became completely unstable as the dunes were eroded back and back and formed a new transgressive dune field phase starting here. Rates of erosion are between 2 and 5 meters per year along the shoreline. And so here's a LiDAR digital elevation model from 2008, and here's the same coastline in 2018. That's where the 2008 dune toe was in here compared to 2018. So quite remarkable change as this cliff or scarp was cut back, slowly destabilized. Sand from that gets cannibalized by the wind and blown landwards to form a new transgressive dune field. We won't worry about this one. And, you know, here's some recent pictures of that dune field. Doesn't look very big on the air photos, but it's becoming quite large. And these dunes are migrating at 7 to 12 meters per year landwards now as they form a new dune field phase. So we're very lucky in South Australia to have large parts of the coast in national parks, large parts uninhabited, and we can get to see lots of natural processes still taking place. Projections for the future, of course, in terms of sea level rise are somewhere between moderate and horrific if we look at recent projections that by 2100 we could have up to 1.4 meters sea level rise and as low as 0.5. It's not looking much like this anymore. It's certainly looking more like plus 1 meter by 2100. And of course, that depends on whether we see ice sheet collapse or not, because we might get a significant jump in sea level if that happens. But bear in mind, all the projections and all the tide gauges around the world are indicating that sea level is rising. And of course, the effects of rising sea level are that we will see greater inundation, greater flooding, more coastal erosion, and of course, we may see more extreme storm conditions. The jury is still out on that in part, but some scientists believe we will certainly see more extreme storm conditions and therefore greater storm surges and more damaging waves. And of course, the thing is, how do dunes respond to this? Well, this is Robin Davidson Arnott, who's a famous coastal guy, model for how the dune and barrier and shore face system responds. So here's sea level at the present time, sea level 1. If you raise the sea level slowly over time, the system can respond by completely translating landwards. So we don't just erode it and put the sand out here in the more simplistic models, but in fact the dunes, if they're given space, can translate quite happily landwards as well, as I'll demonstrate in a moment. So very commonly, of course, during storms, hurricanes, large storm surges, etc. The first stage, if you have a dune at the back of the beach, is that we have scarping of the dune. Of course, a completely natural process. And quite often, if you've got reasonable amount of sand coming back to the beach after the storm, then this will recover. So that's usually followed by the second stage where the scarp, the cliff face dries out and slumps, so it collapses here, but also it starts to dry out and the sand just avalanches and flows down the front, filling up the front, as you see here, and you see in a large scarp here in the Lanfear Dunes in Southern California, a few meters high here. And so that sort of second stage, which might take a few weeks to a few months, just depending, is slumping and drying and avalanching to form this avalanche slope and fill the scarp a bit. And then if sand comes back to the beach after the storm, because remember, quite often in many systems, sand is taken offshore and then the bars slowly migrate back onshore and provide some sand back to the beach. Even if you lose some of the sand, as long as some comes back, then that sand will come back to the beach, be blown back up onto the scarp, as you see on the small scarp here in Stewart Island in the southern bottom of New Zealand, and slowly start to fill the scarp, so you get the scarp fill or ramp fill stage. And then as sand continues to come back, you can fill that entire scarp with not only material that's slumping down here and flowing down here from drying out and slope retreat, but principally as sand comes back from the beach and fills this up, so you have scarp filling or the ramp is accreting here, and that of course creates a perfect aerodynamic ramp. So then what happens is the wind can blow this sand up here, it's compressed, it's accelerated, it puts sand up over the top and up over to the dune crest. And so in this example in Prince Edward Island in Canada, you see that the scarp fill has taken place here under strong winds, flow compression, speed up over here, takes sand off here and dumps it over on the crest. And so basically sand builds the crest, and of course the fine sand grains even go further beyond. They can sometimes go hundreds of meters. You don't need the scarp to be completely filled for this to happen, because once the scarp's 3/4 filled, the wind will do the job and blow it up over the top. And so that's in fact how this translation process happens. Quite often, if it's a reasonable time between storms, then plants will grow back down over onto that scarp fill and rebuild the foredune, and may even start to build a new incipient or newly forming foredune on the front. And so that's the principal mechanism by which foredunes and other dune types can translate backwards, landwards, upwards, with shoreline erosion and or sea level rise. So basically, you chop the dune. As long as some sand comes back to the beach, you fill that ramp, sand gets blown to the top, and the whole system can move backwards and upwards quite happily with sea level rise. So the system has a beautiful way of dealing with sea level rise if we're not in the way. Of course, you have to have space for this to happen, so that if you've built houses, buildings, and you're on, friable cliff tops, then of course there's no way for this to happen. And so the barrier instead, of course, will just translate landwards wholesale, as you see in the Dauphin Island example here. So the foredune response very much depends on sediment supply, or really how much sand comes back to the beach between storms. So if we go to Cape San Blas again, where we did a lot of work in the past, highly variable along here, there is essentially no sand coming on shore, but sand gets eroded from Cape San Blas here, which is a highly eroding point, and gets transported along the barrier and deposited at the end here. If we look in the middle part through here, what you see basically, it has near zero or negative sediment supply. So, here it is in previous dates, 2011, 2012. But basically here is some profiles from previous times. And so this is the dune profile. So you're looking at this, the former part of this dune, which was more seawards and pre-Hurricane Ivan. Here's that dune profile post-Ivan, pre-Hurricane Dennis. And here it is post-Dennis. So this is 04 to 05. So what you see is that every time there's a hurricane, It chomps a bit out, as we saw here with Hurricane Michael in the 2018 storms. And because very little sand comes back onto that beach, then it's net retreat and loss over time. So basically what you're seeing here is that you are getting to a point where you've just got a little pinnacle of sand left, and the next hurricane's going to take that out, the next one or two, and there'll be no dune left. So zero or negative sediment supply leads to net retreat and, of course, complete loss, and then we'll have an overwash flat here into the future. Alrighty, so overall, that's my Dunes 101 very quick visit. Sorry, I've probably been a little too fast in flicking through, but it gives you some idea of how these dune systems evolve and change over time. And nap time is now over.
Nap time. It's almost bedtime here. Thank you, Patrick. Honestly, I think that was an incredible overview, and I think people probably didn't realize just how rich and diverse dunes can be. So we have a few questions, and I think some more probably could be generated based on one of the last things you said, and I think this is something that we have to contend with, and it's something that we need to find an answer for, even if it's not necessarily a natural process. But a lot of our islands, the beachfront is developed, not particularly heavy development, but nevertheless, there is some development. We have some pretty impressive stretches behind people's homes. But you said that, effectively, once there is development directly behind the dunes, that the natural process is effectively broken.
Yeah.
What kind of surrogates can be used and are effective, if any, for the natural process?
Yeah, I mean, the current way of doing this, of course, is to either armor your shoreline, and so you end up with bigger and bigger seawalls, and you typically lose your beach. If you're absolutely wanting to protect the property, and the softer option, of course, is nourishment. And so you pump sand back onto the beach and build, in effect, a natural / artificial foredune in the front of the property again. Really the biggest problem with that into the future is, where will we find the sand resources from to do that? Because if we're mining the near shore constantly, and we're in a negative sediment supply scenario, you're creating a bigger and bigger hole offshore, which waves will want to fill with sand. And so, we scientists talk about the retreat option, so that at a point you say, sorry guys, we can't protect this anymore. When your houses fall in the ocean, we're done, and we're retreating, or we pull them out of the way before that happens and put them somewhere else. There are people who love that notion, but we seldom ever do it. And the only occasions we do is where
serious economic and social upheaval involved in that. But in more short term, because the reality is that even with modest sea level rise, it isn't happening tomorrow that people have to leave, in our case, for instance, right? So one of the other questions that I'll marry it with is, someone asked in their home state of New Jersey, after Christmas, the town asks to take their Christmas trees and place them on the beach to create artificial dunes. I mean, does that work, and does it require a certain amount of sediment supply, or can it work even without necessarily sediment supply?
It'll work in terms of what you're really doing is increasing the aerodynamic roughness, and therefore increasing drag. So you slow the wind down in the branches of the trees. If there's a sand supply, they'll trap sand for sure. They won't stabilize it once they're full of sand, so you then need to plant them, if you want them to stay there. But yes, if there's some sand supply, it's not a bad idea, given most of that shoreline's already, covered in houses and artificial structures. It's certainly better than building seawalls. But if you're in a net or zero sediment supply situation, then you're just going to have your bare trees sitting in the front of your property, really.
Sure. Well, about supply. Talk about that. What can cause a deficit in supply, natural and both human processes? We heard you say that we can overmine the offshore, but what naturally can happen? Why all of a sudden would a sediment supply run out?
It's one of the most intriguing questions, really. So we think that on average, when I talked about those Alabama barriers, for example, that as sea level was rising, you've got a supply sitting on the shelf there. So as sea level's rising, it's pushing some of that shorewards as it rises to build your initial barrier. It's that sea level is in disequilibrium with that slope. So for some time after, sometimes several thousand years, it's slowly pushing sand up that slope to continue to build your barrier. But then it gets to a point where there's no more there available, or it's in equilibrium, with the current conditions, and that's it. And then if there's a strong longshore supply, like on many of your barrier islands, for example, in your part of the Gulf, then sediment is just recycling from somewhere else. So it might be eroding, say, from Sanibel Island and going up to one of the other islands, but it's really just being removed from a local part to another local part. There's not a new supply coming in from the near shore or the surf zone. In places there is. So, for example, why do we have massive transgressive dune fields in South Australia? Because we have the biggest cold water carbonate factory in the world offshore. We're out to 40 meters, 50 meters water depth. We're making new carbonate all the time, new little critters that then get pushed on shore to form our calcareous dominated, carbonate dunes. But you don't have that luxury, unfortunately.
Yeah, right. So talk about the importance, because we always naturally across Florida and in most places, we ask people not to walk on the dunes. And it's certainly, there is an important aspect of protecting habitat, because that is important habitat for critters. But why is it important that our listeners and our visitors not trample vegetation on dunes other than habitat? Is there a good reason?
Yeah, so if you go on Google Earth and you go to some of the British coast, for example, the UK coast, it's very common to have people in summer for the 3 days they have of summer, to go in droves, to go in their hundreds of thousands to the beach, and they're completely uncontrolled pedestrian access. And what you see is dunes just falling apart. So we find, for example, with unrestricted pedestrian access, the first plant species to disappear are the rare species. And then associated with that quite often are the rare animal species. And then very commonly what you develop then is blowouts, because a very good way to make a blowout, all you need to do is reduce the vegetation cover. So you do that by trampling and making tracks and having ORVs, and you start blowouts. And so you change the functioning and the dynamics of the system. Now, in some cases, you're introducing diversity because other plants will come into those environments. But in many cases, you're considerably altering the plant and animal diversity, and then you're altering the way in which the dunes have evolved. And so that's the principal reasons really why we try to, restrict access to certain points. And of course, in your case, if there are small foredunes, you want as much foredune there as you can to protect you against hurricanes. Essentially the bigger the better in this case. And so maintaining its structure and its plant density and its trapping capability is really a critical thing.
Right. Yeah, no, that's helpful. I think this is an interesting one, and I don't know the answer to this, but this is such an interesting subject. How and when did you get interested in sand dunes and their creation?
Well, so I was dragged up on a high energy beach on the west coast of the North Island in New Zealand, and every holiday we went to Granddad's house, which was right in the middle of a massive foredune on a beach. And every holiday I was forced to go into the attic with large Hessian bags and a shovel and shovel the sand out of the attic that got in all the nooks and crannies because it was an old house. and pass them down to Granddad, who ducked them out on the back lawn, which wasn't really lawn. So I became familiar with sand dunes from a very early age. And then when I started my PhD, I was given choices of working on coral reefs and surf zones. And no one was working on dunes at all then. So it was kind of like, why the hell not? It was really completely serendipitous in most cases. And then I segued into desert dunes and every other kind of dune as I went along. Again, because, my students ask me and I usually tell them it's easy to be in the top 10 in the world because there's only 3 of us who do it.
You're being modest. So someone asked, do we have blowouts on Sanibel and Captiva? Is this something that happens with larger dunes, or does it happen with dunes our size as well?
No, it happens in dunes your size. From a casual look over Google Earth, I don't think you do. But take 40 school children out onto a 4 dune, you can make one.
No one listened to it. We're not messing with dunes, anyone. Here's a good question. I mean, is it the same? For instance, is the process similar with lake dunes, like around Lake Michigan, as it would be for ocean dunes? Is it the same principles involved?
Exactly. So any coast or any beach formed on the side of a river, on a lake, lagoon, estuary, you very commonly have on many lakes and estuaries and lagoons these beach ridges or 4 dunes. But in the Great Lakes, there are wonderful, large climbing parabolic dune systems and transgressive dune fields all along parts of the Great Lakes, yes.
One more that I want to touch on before we let you go. We very much appreciate it. One thing I thought as you were speaking, that I'm surprised that Cape Cod hasn't used the bowl blowout capital of the world on their tourism pamphlets, because that certainly seems like quite a claim to fame. But what is particularly special about that? I don't think we gleaned that from maybe what you showed us. Why does that lend itself to so many of those sorts of pock marks?
Yeah, well, while working up there with the national parks, we tried to get that done, that it became the saucer and bowl blowout capital of the world, but it didn't happen. We think it's just this particular kind of set of conditions. So they get bloody big nor'easters there quite often. They get declining hurricanes and tropical storms quite often make their way up the coast there and spin off Cape Cod. So you get very big winds at times, and they often coincide with the period around spring. And so because they get pretty severe winters up there quite often, the Ammophila plant cover dies right back during winter. And in spring, there's very little plant cover. And if you get a big storm right around then, very easy to erode out some area where there's less plant cover than sprouting somewhere else. There is also a sort of general malaise with Ammophila dieback across that part of the world. And so those little sand patches I was showing, they might be because there's been more ice cover in winter, but it might also be that's evidence of the dieback. We're unsure. And so you're seeing, lots of those patches develop all over the dune fields. So I think it's just a combination of spring, low cover, high winds, and of course a big dune field, big parabolic dunes that all that's happening on. So you've got a substrate, beautiful for erosion, and maybe the dieback problem as well.
One thing that I was thinking about as I was looking at these pictures again, when you said in South Australia, there's a dune field that I think you said 150 kilometers from the shore inland. You said it's similar to a desert, but why is it not a desert? I mean, is there enough rain to not be classified as a desert? Is the system necessarily different?
Oh no, so it really is a coastal desert. Okay. If we talk about the strict definitions of desert, then it's got to be below, I think, 300 millimeters rainfall or something in that ballpark. I forget quite, 250 maybe. So in many cases, these are arid to semi-arid environments for sure, because rainfall over there is about 300 mil. per year, and may have been less or more in the past. We just coined the term transgressive dune fields sometime back in the 50s, and it's kind of stuck. But really, they have all the same elements and are just smaller than most deserts. For example, if we look at this one at the bottom, the various desert dune types are all present on these coastal transgressive dune field systems. So, they're very, very similar, and it's really semantics, Ryan.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. Here's a fun question. Do you have a favorite dune? Let's say, do you have a favorite geographic dune, and do you have a favorite dune type?
Yeah, I think I've spent more time working on foredunes than any other dune type. I think I've published 120 papers on foredunes, which is madness in itself. That's more than any person living or dead, which is no claim to fame. So it's just bloody silly. So probably foredunes are kind of my favorite, but I lived in Namibia for some time, and the 150-meter high linear dunes, complex linear dunes there, are just magnificent, amazing dunes. And so probably that's my favorite if I had to pick one.
Well, that's great. Well, Patrick, I want to thank you for spending part of your morning with us all. I know everyone, dunes are such an important part of our daily lives. To hear it in the context of the globe is, I think, important for everyone who listened, because sometimes we think of things too often in this world in vacuums, and I think understanding larger dune processes across the globe is something that is incredibly helpful for everyone. So thank you for your time, and thank you all who are tuned in here for attending our lecture this evening. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you again soon in person. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ron. Thank you all, and good luck in these COVID days.